After the First Battle of Manassas, the Confederate Army of the Potomac sat idle in northern Virginia. Some generals, Thomas Stonewall Jackson included, urged for a pursuit of the Federals and/or an attack on Washington, D.C. The Confederate High Command waved off those ideas. In northwestern Virginia, prominent commanders later in the war fought along the boundaries of Virginia and Maryland, including William S. Rosecrans and Robert E. Lee. One reason for troops sent to that district was the vital Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, as well as the C&O Canal. When the southern states seceded from the Union, states like Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas blocked off the Mississippi River. Prior to the war, Midwestern farmers in Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Iowa, and Wisconsin depended on river travel to get their goods to market. Additionally, railroads that ran from north to south became cut off as well. Now that the Confederacy prevented trade from taking place along the river and along those rail lines, the Midwestern farmers sought another way to get goods to market. They turned toward west to east trade along railroads and canals, two prominent ones being the B&O Railroad and the C&O Canal. Confederate destruction of the railroad and attempts to make the canal useless threatened the flow of goods from west to east. Railroads further north could transport them, but each railroad or waterway that became incapable of transportation drove freight costs up, further hurting the Midwestern farmers. Abraham Lincoln wanted the flow of goods for military purposes, but also to relieve the financial problems of farmers who now faced the ever-increasing possibility that it could cost more to ship these goods to market than they would get in return for their crops. Low morale from financial despair could result in citizens turning against prosecuting the war. Therefore, securing the northwestern portion of Virginia and Maryland became integral to the Union war effort. Also on the minds of the Union High Command was the rich agricultural region of the Shenandoah Valley. From the time settlement started in the valley, Virginians prospered financially from growing corn and, more importantly, wheat for the state and the nation. Beyond agriculture, the valley possessed significant industry, including iron furnaces, tanneries, and lumber mills, all necessary for the Confederate war effort. However, the Confederacy faced problems in the valley. Unionist sympathies ran high, especially the closer to the Potomac River and the Maryland border one went. Their close ties to the north made them financially reliant on northern manufacturers and purchasing agents, which created a hostile borderland for both the Union and the Confederacy as segments of the population began to take sides. Losing the Shenandoah Valley meant losing a major area of production and agriculture for the Confederacy, which made securing it even more important. The Confederacy stationed units in the valley, but Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, sought to place someone acquainted with the area in command of the valley. Stonewall Jackson's name came forth from the people in the valley and the Confederate High Command, knowing that he hailed from Lexington, Virginia. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston balked at losing one of his more capable commanders, but agreed to send him minus the famed Stonewall Brigade. Winchester, one of the main towns in the valley, became the headquarters of Jackson when he arrived in November 1861. Union forces in the region were under the command of Nathaniel Banks, who knew the importance of the B&O Railroad and the C&O Canal. His mildly aggressive stance contrasted with his superior George McClellan's defensive stance. Banks made his headquarters at Frederick, Maryland, but kept a smattering of troops on the border and in Virginia. One of Banks' subordinates, Brigadier General Frederick Lander, fought for an aggressive campaign in northwest Virginia. Lander, born in Massachusetts, crossed the United States surveying for railroads to link the east and west coast, and even surveyed the Lander Road as an alternative to get to the Oregon Territory. He constantly petitioned Banks and McClellan to allow him to take troops into the valley, but both generals hesitated issuing the orders. At Edwards Ferry, Lander received an ugly bullet wound in the leg. This incapacitated him and prevented him from taking the field like he wanted. As the commander in the valley, Jackson took on an important role as the far left flank of the Confederate Army of the Potomac under Joseph E. Johnston at Centerville. If Union forces captured the valley, Johnston's left flank could easily come under threat from Union troops moving up the valley and through one of the many gaps and surprising his army. Likewise, the presence of Johnston's army protected Jackson's right flank, but Stonewall still worried about his left. A Union force at Romney worried him the most, and when he got reinforced by the Army of the Northwest under General William Loring, he launched an expedition against Union forces to the west. On January 1, 1862, Jackson set out with around 9,000 men from Winchester toward the town of Bath. It was unusually warm at the start, but quickly a snowstorm drifted in, freezing the soldiers who had left their overcoats and blankets behind or in supply wagons. The Federal troops around that town withdrew under orders from McClellan and Banks, who wanted to wait until spring to make any move into Virginia. Jackson then pressed on to the Potomac River, across from the town of Hancock. Lander's men occupied the town, and Jackson gave the Union commander 2 hours to evacuate the citizens. Lander refused to surrender or leave, and withstood the shelling from the Confederate artillery. Jackson detached part of his command to destroy sections of the B&O Railroad and attempt to bust a dam for the C&O Canal, but no great progress could be made against the canal's dam. Unable to cause any significant damage to Lander's men, Jackson then set off for Romney. Again, those Federals had withdrawn, leaving it in the hands of Jackson's men. But the journey to capture Romney came with consequences. The men froze as they marched, and those that could had to help push artillery and wagons up hills covered in ice, and held them back so not to shove the horses into the hard ground. Despite their efforts, many horses received broken legs and other injuries, along with rank-and-file soldiers getting injured and sick from exposure. Loring and men in his command went above Jackson's head to the Secretary of War, Judah Benjamin, asking that Jackson be relieved of command for endangering the lives of his men. Jackson offered his resignation in protest, which the President would not accept. To soothe the anger of both men, the Secretary of War transferred Loring and some of his regiments out of Jackson's command. To prevent further injury to his army, Jackson moved his brigades from Romney to Winchester, where they could recuperate. However, disease, desertion, and furloughs greatly reduced his fighting force. Year-long enlistments were coming up in the spring, and Jefferson Davis signed a law giving a furlough to those men who re-enlisted. Although it would raise morale, it depleted Jackson's ranks. Word from deserters and spies relayed the information to Banks that Jackson possessed few troops and would ultimately have to fall back, especially since Johnston was pulling back to Culpeper. In late February, Banks's forces crossed the Potomac River under the supervision of McClellan. By March 2nd, Williams's brigade captured Martinsburg, and the other Federal brigades and divisions began to close in on the Confederate force in Winchester. On March 7th, Williams moved up the valley toward Winchester and encountered Turner Ashby's cavalry, who they pushed aside, gaining more information about the state of Jackson's force at Winchester. On March 10th, Jackson declared martial law in the town, arresting several dozen men who had held a Union meeting in anticipation of Union forces occupying the town. The situation was becoming dire as Jackson only possessed a little under 5,000 men, being outnumbered by the approaching Federals 6-1. He needed to act before it was too late. Nathaniel Banks's division and brigade commanders chomped at the bit to attack Jackson at Winchester, but he held them back, preferring to force Jackson to evacuate Winchester without a fight. Besides, not all of Sedgwick's brigades were up, and with McClellan capturing Manassas and Johnston's Confederate army pulling back to Culpeper, the advantage was firmly on the side of the Union. After Lander succumbed to a combination of pneumonia and the bullet wound, Brigadier General James Shields took command of his division. Shields, an Irish immigrant who met Abraham Lincoln on the dueling grounds at one point and who fought gallantly in the Mexican-American War, being wounded twice, seemed a natural choice as a brigadier general of volunteers. The Union brigades and division commanders who pressed up the valley to Winchester planned to go against Banks's orders not to attack and assault the Confederate works on the morning of March 12th. On March 11th, Jackson's brigades marched to the north end of town and took up their positions in their makeshift entrenchments. Stonewall sent the wagons south of the town, where the men would travel through the town from their positions to get supper before returning to the entrenchments. Jackson formulated a plan to launch a night attack against the Federals just to the north and held a council of war to see what his brigade commanders thought of the plan. None of his subordinates thought a night attack a good idea, infuriating Jackson. Then, some of his officers told him that without knowing what Jackson's intentions were, the supply wagons didn't stop on the south side of town and continued for 5 miles, and the regiments marched after them, following the commander's orders to get something to eat. Jackson's refusal to tell his subordinates his plan had cost him the ability to launch the attack he wanted. At midnight, he issued the needless order to evacuate Winchester. Many of his troops were already on their way south. He declared that he would never hold another council of war, and rode south with his surgeon Hunter McGuire. At 3 a.m., the exhausted Jackson sat down in a fence corner and went to sleep. Later that morning, Union forces cautiously entered Winchester. The town was theirs. Unionists hung United States flags from their windows, and secessionists cursed the Yankee soldiers in the street. One young secessionist lady nearly walked underneath a United States flag. One of her friends asked if she would walk under such a dirty rag. She replied never, and went out of her way to not walk under it. A Union soldier nearby shouted, "Mrs., I think you have a dirtier rag under the skirts of your dresses." The Army of the Valley encamped near Cedar Creek, and Jackson became concerned he still remained too close to the larger Union force and moved just north of Mount Jackson to Red Banks, one of the largest and most impressive homes in the valley. Jackson kept in mind Johnston's order to keep Banks busy so that he did not reinforce McClellan. Stonewall would need to stay far enough away from Banks to give himself enough freedom of movement, yet close enough that Banks didn't think he'd left the valley. A reorganization of the Army of the Potomac, brought on by a contention between Abraham Lincoln and George McClellan, resulted in reducing the valley of federal troops. McClellan planned to land at Fort Monroe on the peninsula formed by the James and York Rivers, but before he did, Lincoln wanted him to secure Washington, D.C., and place a significant force at Manassas to thwart any attempt by the Confederates to attack Washington. McClellan wanted Banks to occupy that location, and Sedgwick's division left Banks's corps, leaving just Alpheus Williams and James Shields' divisions in the valley, but that was soon to change if Jackson could be ousted from the valley. Under orders, James Shields scouted south of Winchester to Strasburg, capturing the town but being contested every step of the way by Turner Ashby's 700 horsemen and Chew's battery. Shields' force numbered over 8,000 men, but Ashby delayed them significantly with mostly just one artillery battery. Union soldiers could spot the young cavalier atop his white horse, supervising his artillery. One Union soldier wrote, "This Ashby was the terror and the wizard of the Shenandoah. He was represented as being always mounted on a white horse, of being everywhere present, and of wearing a charmed life. Consequently, everything astride a white horse in front, in rear, along the mountains, near at hand, or in the distance, was at once conjured up in the minds of the soldiers to be Ashby. His apparition had presented itself frequently during the day, and still hovered about fitfully in the advance. On March 20th, Shields marched his division back to Winchester. He and Banks were exceedingly happy with the reconnaissance, and mused that they had seen the last of Jackson. Williams's division departed for Centerville, leaving Shields alone at Winchester. While at Mount Jackson, Stonewall got a small group of reinforcements, militia called up by the governor of Virginia, John Letcher, to support Jackson. The 400 men would help, but one man from the militia would be worth more than all the others combined. Jedediah Hotchkiss, a native New Yorker, had moved to the Shenandoah Valley years earlier as a teacher, geologist, and cartographer. He made a map for Robert E. Lee when that general campaigned in western Virginia, and now, very soon, Jackson would use him to make maps of the Shenandoah Valley. On March 22nd, Jackson marched north, concentrating his small army of around 4,000 men at Strasburg. There he waited for reports from Ashby, scouting in front. The cavalrymen engaged with Federals on the south side of Winchester, prompting Shields to ready his division for combat and sending Kimball's brigade to engage the enemy. During the heavy skirmishing and artillery duel, an artillery shell knocked Shields unconscious and wounded him. He would come to only to pass out from the pain. By night, Ashby retreated and informed Jackson that only a skeleton force occupied Winchester and that they were preparing to leave for Harper's Ferry. None of that information was true. Shields' whole division occupied Winchester, and neither he nor Banks was preparing to move north. Jackson knew that he needed to keep as many Federals in the valley as possible to keep them from moving east to support McClellan, and the best way to do that was to attack and force Banks to come after him. The morning of March 23rd dawned, and Kimball assumed Ashby had fled and sent out a scouting party to the south. The scouts found Ashby had returned, this time with infantry. Ashby's cavalry and infantry went out into a skirmish line around the community of Kernstown. Seeing the tactical value of Pritchard's Hill lying northwest of Kernstown, Kimball ordered 3 artillery batteries to that hill. Knowing artillery alone could not throw back Ashby, he ordered 4 of the untested 67th Ohio, who had yet to see combat, and the 5th Ohio from Sullivan's brigade to secure his artillery atop Pritchard's Hill. It was now 9 a.m., and the two sides threw artillery shells at one another while Ashby concocted a plan. He thought only 4 Federal regiments remained in the town, so most of the infantry and artillery must now be on the field. Therefore, he thought he could flank them and press on to Winchester. Ashby shifted his infantry and cavalry to the east of the Valley Turnpike and then began to engage with Federal skirmishers. They initially gained an advantage on the Blue troops, but then Kimball called forward the 14th Indiana. The men from Indiana rushed down the Valley Pike and then deployed into line of battle, delivering significant volleys into the Gray troops. Despite the resistance, Ashby still thought that a small force remained around Winchester. He broke off his flanking movement, and the 14th Indiana, 8th Ohio, and 5th Ohio pursued the rebels a short distance. Jackson confidently pushed his infantry down the Valley Pike toward Kernstown, confident in victory. He wrote to Johnston that he hoped to be in Winchester by the evening. Banks was still at Winchester, but believed this nothing more than cavalry and left for Washington. Shields remarked that Jackson would not fight, that Jackson was afraid of him. At the behest of Kimball, Colonel Jeremiah Sullivan marched his brigade in battle line south and formed on Kimball's left, across the pike. Kimball also wanted to reinforce his position and sent the 84th Pennsylvania to the junction of Pritchard's Lane and the Middle Road. Jackson arrived at the battlefield around noon and thought he may delay attacking until the next morning since it was Sunday and he did not want to fight on a Sabbath. However, when he gazed through his field glasses, he could see Union artillery silhouetted on Pritchard Hill. The infantry remained just out of sight. Still acting on Ashby's earlier report that only a small group of Federals guarded the town, Jackson moved his 3,000 infantry down the Valley Pike. Before his men got within rifle range of the guns perched atop Pritchard's Hill, he sent Fulkerson's brigade in front with the Stonewall Brigade under Richard Garnett west of the pike and his artillery, supported by Burke's brigade, to the east. He hoped to turn the Union right flank and drive them from the field. The 5th Virginia from the Stonewall Brigade and the 48th Virginia from Burke's brigade were held back in reserve to guard the wagon train. Shields, from his sick bed recovering from his fractured arm, sent messages to Kimball to attack. Kimball could see the situation was much more grave than Shields thought and refused to launch an attack. Between 1:30 and 2 o'clock, Fulkerson's 2-regiment brigade, with the Stonewall Brigade supposedly behind, advanced on the Union position. The exposed position of the Virginians forced Fulkerson to seek shelter in some trees, where his command got pelted with artillery shells for around 30 minutes. Garnett rode with the commander of the 33rd Virginia, his lead regiment, but did not communicate the role of the rest of the brigade to his regimental commanders. What resulted was the rest of the brigade stayed put, while the 33rd advanced into the same open ground that Fulkerson had and were hit with significant artillery fire. They darted onto Sandy Ridge with no other help around. Jackson took command of the Stonewall Brigade and ordered Sandy Pendleton to get them en route. He organized the 2nd and 4th Virginia to advance towards Sandy Ridge, encountering the same artillery as the other 2 regiments. Concerned that the Union commander may see him massing infantry on Sandy Ridge, Jackson ordered Ashby's cavalry to attack the Union left flank, but with only 150 troopers at his disposal, he did little more than gain the attention of Kimball, which was exactly what Jackson needed, a diversion. The cavalrymen then pulled back to safety. Jackson now began to move the rest of his force to Sandy Ridge. It was around 3 p.m. when the 1st Virginia, 27th Virginia, and 21st Virginia shuffled to the left of Jackson's line, along with the artillery prepared to unleash fury upon the Federal troops. Jackson had the artillery stop and counter the Union gunners' fire, which sent the infantry fleeing to the backside of Pritchard Hill. Jackson clapped his hands, exclaiming, "Good, good." From atop Sandy Ridge, Sandy Pendleton of Jackson's staff could see beyond Pritchard Hill and was astonished to see at least 10,000 Union soldiers. He informed Jackson, who told him to say nothing. Then the general stated, "We are in for it." Pendleton counted 5 regimental flags approaching Sandy Ridge. Something needed to be done to thwart their advance. With Garnett nowhere to be found, Jackson ordered forward the 27th Virginia to support the batteries perched on Sandy Ridge to protect them from the approaching infantry. They lined up along a stone wall and prepared themselves. The Union brigade approaching the Virginians was under Erastus Tyler. The Ohioan did not deploy his brigade into battle line. He also was not aware of the infantry laying in his front. He thought he was simply going to outflank the artillery on Sandy Ridge. When his men entered the forest on Sandy Ridge, they encountered skirmishers and the main line of Virginians. One Ohioan described it as a tornado 10 times intensified when the musketry hit them. Confusion reigned in Tyler's brigade as the first 2 regiments bumped into one another, causing the lines of men to intermingle. Officers attempted to extricate their companies from the others, and many of the 7th Ohio shuffled into a ravine to protect themselves from bullets. As the bullets whizzed over the heads of the other regiments, the 1st Virginia held firm, but the 110th Pennsylvania fled to the rear, despite attempts to bring them back to the front. Jackson scoured the battlefield, attempting to unite his entire army in their stance on Sandy Ridge. He found and ordered forward the 21st Virginia, who took up a position on the right of the 27th, followed by the 23rd and 37th Virginia, who took up a position on the left of the line. Tyler attempted to extend his line to the right by ordering the 1st Virginia to the west, which they promptly did, but as they formed and advanced toward the stone wall, their colonel went down with an arm wound, which caused the regiment to halt and fall back. The reason Jackson personally ordered the regiments forward was because he could not find Richard Garnett. Garnett was attempting to locate all of his regiments who got separated during the early stages of the battle and would personally lead the 33rd and 4th Virginia to the stone wall, placing them alongside their embattled comrades. Eventually, Jackson would get the 2nd Virginia Regiment and the 1st Virginia Battalion, also known as the Irish Battalion, to the stone wall. The Confederate battle line was now about 500 yards long, and even though they were positioned behind a great barrier, the regiments took considerable punishment. It was 4:30 p.m. and Jackson assessed the situation. He repulsed Tyler's brigade, but he was still outnumbered. However, he did have 3 regiments in reserve. If he could hold out for another 2 hours, when darkness would cover the field, he could at least hope for a draw. He wagered that Kimball couldn't get another attack organized in the last few hours of the day. He was wrong, but not by much. Kimball sent the 3 regiments guarding Pritchard Hill to charge the Confederate position. The attack went awry almost immediately when Kimball ordered his bugler to sound recall. Some of the companies heard that order and came back to Pritchard Hill, which reduced the number of men committed to battle. Furthermore, the 84th Pennsylvania, who had a mutiny previous to the battle and entered the engagement with many of its officers absent, melted away when confronted by the Confederate bullets. The 5th Ohio lost 9 flag bearers as they advanced and fought against Jackson's lines. Kimball sent in the 14th Indiana to shore up the battle line, but that regiment was led by a drunk lieutenant colonel named William Harrow. One soldier stated that he was so drunk he had no idea what he was doing, which proved true when the first volley he ordered was into the backs of the 5th Ohio. After that debacle, the 14th Indiana slid to the left of the Ohioans as the 3 regiments moved up the hill toward the stubborn Confederates. It was about 6 p.m. and quickly growing dark. Paul Truckee, a 6'6" Hoosier, was overcome with excitement and waved his Enfield over his head and yelled, "Come on, boys!" One of his comrades described him as wild as a deer, ran headlong after the rebels as a dog would chase a rabbit, loading and firing as he went. The regiment slammed into the Confederate line, which began to give way. Union soldiers began to charge on their own accord, chasing after the rebels. 2 soldiers found themselves way out in front of the Union line when a bullet ricocheted off a tree and hit one of them. The uninjured man described the scene. He was a good-sized fat boy, and when he fell, he made a noise like a bawling calf. I sprang to him, and having thought I had heard the bullet strike and fall to the ground, I did not understand why he looked so lifeless. I felt his limb and soon found the dent the ball made. I then came to the conclusion that the blow had stopped the circulation, and I began rubbing the limb strongly. Within a moment or two, Dave's eyes began to open, and he exclaimed, "Doggone, that feels good," when again we started, still in view of those we were following. The Confederate regiments began to withdraw from the stone wall, with parts of Tyler's brigade pursuing as much as they could in the growing darkness. Confederates scattered in all different directions as Federal cavalry scoured the fields and forests around where the fight took place. Jackson attempted to rally and reinforce his men, but it was all in vain. His brigades found their way to the Valley Pike and started heading south. Close to Newton, Jackson and his aides sat near a fire, exhausted after a long day. A young artilleryman commented to Jackson, "General, it looks like you cut off more tobacco today than you could chew," to which Jackson replied, "Oh, I think we did very well." Out of around 8,500 troops engaged, the Union lost 118 killed, 450 wounded, and 22 captured or missing, for a total of 590. Out of around 3,800 troops engaged, the Confederacy lost 80 killed, 375 wounded, and 263 captured or missing, for a total of 718. Although the battle ended in defeat for Jackson, it accomplished a huge strategic goal for the Confederacy. Until the Battle of Kernstown, Nathaniel Banks was shifting troops further east to protect Washington, D.C., and give support to George McClellan's planned Peninsula Campaign. The strong presence made by Jackson signaled to Union forces that he was very much a threat and was still in the valley. This made the Union High Command rethink their overall strategy in the Eastern Theater. After Kernstown, Jackson retreated south, but he did not forget about Johnston's orders to keep the Union Army busy. Jackson was proactive, knowing he needed a cartographer. Colonel Baylor introduced Jedediah Hotchkiss to Jackson. When they met in late March, the two men talked about Hotchkiss's work. Then Jackson said, "I want you to make me a map of the valley, from Harper's Ferry to Lexington, showing all the points of offense and defense in those places." At that point, Hotchkiss left Jackson's headquarters and began his task. On April 1st, Jackson placed Richard Garnett under arrest for neglect of duty at Kernstown. The commander believed that his brigadier's decision to quit the field denied the Valley Army of a victory at Kernstown. Garnett, under guard, went to Harrisonburg without knowing the specifications of the charge against him. He would be replaced by Charles Winder. Winder was a Marylander, a West Point graduate, and a known disciplinarian, which would not gain him much love from the troops whose commander he replaced. On the Union side, Shields placed a moratorium on outgoing mail so that he could get the first word to the Union High Command and the newspapers about the battle. His battle description was simply fantasy, claiming that he had ordered the artillery placements and the attack on Sandy Ridge all from his sickbed. He wrote, "The havoc which has been made in the ranks of the rebels has struck a blow such as they nowhere else endured since the commencement of the war. Jackson and his Stonewall Brigade and all the other brigades accompanying him will never meet this division again in battle." The letters he sent out sparked the Secretary of State William Seward to visit the battlefield on March 28th, along with his children. However, men in Shields' command knew the truth. One soldier wrote, "I suppose you might have read General Shields' private letter about the battle at Winchester. A more barefaced series of Irish romances I never read. The man actually has the gall to connect his fortunate blunders into a chain of shrewd stratagems, and with after-event wisdom to glorify him." Kimball also knew the truth and hoped that correct reports would validate his actions at the Battle of Kernstown. Jackson's attack at Kernstown complicated the Union strategy. As McClellan moved for the peninsula with his juggernaut of an army, General McDowell with around 30,000 men encamped along the Potomac near Fredericksburg, and Banks was supposed to join McDowell to make demonstrations against the Confederate capital from the north. However, now Lincoln and his cabinet feared that if they sent forces from the valley to McDowell's command, then that would expose Washington, D.C. to Jackson's army. So Banks' command was to stay in and near the valley. To add to Union security, John C. Fremont took control of the Mountain Department, encompassing most of what is now West Virginia. But although he had around 25,000 men on paper, present for duty numbers was around 22,000, and all of those were spread around the region with little supplies or means of transportation. Banks was tasked with pushing Jackson out of the valley and positioning himself to not let the Confederate leader back into the region. With Williams' division recalled from going east, Banks sought to follow his orders and push Stonewall south. Williams marched his men to Woodstock, fighting Ashby's cavalry, supplemented with infantry along the way. Gordon, one of Williams' brigade commanders, wrote, "Ashby was as cool and brave as he was experienced. I think our men had a kind of admiration for the man, as he sat unmoved upon his horse and let our men pepper away at him as if he enjoyed it." Jackson moved his division south of Mount Jackson to Rude's Hill as the Federal forces got closer. The Union push south stopped a little south of Woodstock. The Corps lacked sufficient transportation for their supplies, and the wagons that did catch up to them suffered because of the poor horses and muddy roads resulting from the heavy rains in late March and early April. One Federal officer recalled that after the Battle of Kernstown, his men were issued new shoes, but those wore out in 2 weeks because of the shoddy construction, and most of his men were barefoot. After a 15-day rest, waiting for supplies to catch up to his command, Banks moved on Mount Jackson, hoping to capture Newmarket. Banks formed up his corps in front of Rude's Hill, preparing to launch an attack on Jackson's lines, but Stonewall withdrew toward Harrisonburg, keeping in contact with Richard Ewell's 8,500-man division to the east, the only major Confederate force between himself and Johnston at Richmond. From there, Jackson traveled around the tip of the Massanutten Mountains, putting distance between himself and the approaching Federal troops. Then his division moved to just beyond Conrad's store near Swift Run Gap, the location where Ewell was to meet him if called upon. The Valley Army had marched 50 miles in 3 days. The people of Stanton, with their stores of ammunition and clothing for the Confederate armies, panicked at the thought of Jackson abandoning them, but Jackson's movement would help protect Stanton. If Banks moved on the town, he could hit them in the flank. Otherwise, Union forces would pursue him instead of going toward the town. Banks did march to and occupy Harrisonburg. Due to the discipline of many of the officers, actions against the people of Harrisonburg were minimal, and many sold their goods to Union soldiers looking to supplement their bland army rations with something different. Jackson's army got reorganized while near Swift Run Gap. Under the mandate of the Conscription Act, regiments were to hold elections to choose officers. However, an officer returned to the valley at this time, William B. Tolliver. He had been a vocal opponent of Jackson for Stonewall's actions during the Romney expedition and had resigned, but now he returned to replace Fulkerson at the head of that brigade. Also, Colonel Jesse Burks went on extended sick leave, placing Colonel John A. Campbell of the 48th Virginia at the head of the brigade. Part of Ashby's cavalry patrolled to the north to prevent any Union forces from getting into the rear of Jackson's army. Banks wired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton that Jackson was on his way to Johnston on the peninsula, and there was little else to do in the valley, so he pulled back to Newmarket. At that town, Banks used the gap in the mountains to test Jackson's strength. He sent Sullivan's brigade to do the probing, but Banks saw no reason for his command to stay that far south if Jackson was leaving. But Jackson was not leaving. He was planning his next move. He proposed a few options to General Robert E. Lee, military advisor to President Jefferson Davis. One, he was to travel down the valley toward Front Royal to draw Banks further north, or he could link up with Brigadier General Edward Johnson, who was further west, and attack advanced Union threats in western Virginia. Lee let Jackson decide, and Stonewall chose to link up with Johnson, knowing that Banks's force was still too large to attack even if he combined his and Ewell's forces. Stonewall Jackson called on Ewell and his division to occupy Swift Run Gap, while he crossed over the Blue Ridge Mountains at Brown's Gap to Meacham Station, and loaded his men on trains to Stanton. He hoped that this would convince Banks he was leaving the valley, but that didn't work. Nevertheless, Edward Johnson's troops had been pushed out of the Allegheny Plateau near Stanton by the approaching brigades of Brigadier Generals Robert Milroy and Robert Schenck. If Fremont's army and the Mountain Department ever linked up with Banks, then Jackson knew he would not have an adequate force to confront them, so he must defeat them in detail. On May 7th, Jackson and Johnson pushed west toward the little hamlet of McDowell. On the morning of May 8th, Milroy and Schenck collaborated on a plan to halt the approaching rebels. The 2nd Virginia Infantry sat atop Sitlington's Hill, with the 1st Virginia Cavalry positioned along the turnpike, and part of the 73rd Ohio sat to the right of the 2nd Virginia. The 82nd Ohio, with an artillery battery, covered the road to the west. At noon, rebel forces could be seen approaching. It was Jackson and Johnson and their staffs arriving to reconnoiter the ground. Jackson did not want to fight on that day and made preparations to outflank them in the morning. To deal with the skirmishers on Sitlington's Hill, Johnson deployed the 52nd Virginia, but the fighting grew more intense, and the 44th Virginia was called up to strengthen the Confederate line, with the 58th close behind to secure the right flank. The rebels were able to force the Federal soldiers back. A lull covered the battlefield, except for the fire of the Union artillery. Jackson assumed that that was the last of the fighting for the day, but he was horribly wrong. Milroy and Schenck agreed on a reconnaissance in force against the hill. He assembled 5 regiments to attack Jackson and Johnson's force. Likewise, seeing the assembling Federals, Johnson moved up additional reinforcements. It was after 6 p.m. before Milroy's Ohioans and Virginians made contact with Johnson's lines. Members of the 31st Virginia and the 3rd Virginia collided near the turnpike. Both units had been part of the same militia unit before the war at Clarksburg, Virginia. When the Civil War broke out, the unit split in its loyalty, and now they faced one another on the battlefield. They got close enough to one another to recognize individual faces and called out to their former friends. Jackson sent in reinforcements to relieve some of the embattled units. The 12th Georgia, out in front of the main line, was running low on ammunition and fell back to the main line. The 48th Virginia took its place and stabilized the line in the face of the approaching Federals. About 9 p.m., the firing slowed down. Although Milroy's troops made gallant attacks up the hill, they could not push the numerically superior forces away. At around 10 p.m., Milroy ordered the evacuation of McDowell. When the battle closed, the Union lost 26 killed, 230 wounded, and 3 men missing, for a total of 259 casualties. The Confederacy lost 146 men killed, 382 wounded, and 4 men captured, for a total of 532. The 12th Georgia represented a large portion of the casualties because of their advanced position during the battle. After McDowell, Jackson gave chase to the retreating Federals. Schenck and Milroy lit the forest on fire on both sides of the road to further hinder the approach of the Confederate columns. They withdrew to Franklin, where they believed Fremont would meet them, but when they got there, he was nowhere to be found. Jackson and Johnson advanced on Franklin. They had successfully prevented the linking up of Banks and Fremont, and driven the forces in front of Johnson away. Now Jackson sought to link up with Ewell and deliver a blow to Banks, especially now that Shields' division had been sent east out of the valley. Ewell was given conflicting reports from Lee and Johnston. One of those directives stated that if Banks left the valley, Ewell and Jackson were to go east to link up with the Confederate forces at Fredericksburg. Half of Banks' force had left, but the other half had remained, entrenched around Strasburg. So Ewell traveled to speak with Jackson at his current location outside of Harrisonburg. They agreed to link up to attack Banks, the best option to divert troops away from McDowell's force near Fredericksburg. To make the march through Page Valley quicker for Ewell, he would detach Richard Taylor's Louisiana Brigade from his main force to pass to the south of the Massanutten Mountains, and then join Jackson's columns as they moved toward Newmarket and Mount Jackson. They hoped to link up on May 21st. However, as Ewell made it to his objective, a message came from Johnston recalling Ewell's division to Richmond to confront McClellan. Jackson and Ewell met in a grove of trees and decided that the best way to protect Richmond was to attack Banks and draw troops from McDowell. A message then came from Johnston stating, "If you and General Ewell, united, can beat Banks, do it." The two Virginians agreed that attacking Banks's fortifications at Strasburg would be foolhardy, so they would move into Page Valley and attack the Union garrison at Front Royal, placing themselves in between Banks and McDowell, forcing Banks to retreat from his fortifications. All of Jackson and Ewell's forces met at Newmarket. From there, Taylor's brigade led the way through Newmarket Gap, while leaving a few companies of cavalry just south of Strasburg to screen the army's movements, as well as give alarm if Banks decided to move in either direction. The Gray troops passed through the Massanutten Mountains and approached the little town of Front Royal, Virginia, on May 23rd. Jackson's troops surprised the Union garrison guarding the town. The small band of occupiers saw Confederate soldiers approaching at 2:30 p.m. Jackson sent Ashby's cavalry on the west side of the river to tear up the railroad and cut telegraph wires, as well as probe the flanks of the garrison troops. Next, Jackson called up the 1st Maryland to start the attack. What the general did not know was that many of the troops' enlistments had ended. Those troops mutinied and were placed under arrest until the campaign was over. But when called upon, the commander of the 1st Maryland delivered a rousing speech that brought many of the mutineers back into the ranks for the fight. They approached the town with Wheat's Tigers on their left. By surprising the Federals, the Marylanders and Louisianians forced the Unionist Marylanders north of town, where the terrain was more defensible atop Richardson's Hill. The famous female spy Belle Boyd was in the town when Jackson's men began to move through it. She ran to Confederate lines and informed part of Jackson's staff that the Federal force was small and could easily be whipped, then ran back into town. The information that she relayed was not new to Jackson, who knew that only a small force garrisoned the town. The two sides skirmished back and forth, but more rebel regiments were showing themselves on the field. It was now around 4 p.m., and the noose was tightening around Kenly's Marylanders. The 2nd and 6th Virginia Cavalry regiments galloped down the Strasburg Front Royal Road and put pressure on the 29th Pennsylvania, who guarded the flank across the river from Kenly. Ashby's troops threatened the troops near Buckton, making an attack on their encampment. However, the blue troops were too well equipped and prepared for the cavalry, driving Ashby away from their camp. Kenly called for the 5th New York Cavalry to lend him some help. They crossed the river to the other side, taking enemy artillery fire and musketry as they did. Kenly threw them into the fight, which threw back the rebels for a few moments so his Marylanders could catch their breath. The 5th joined the men from Maryland to defend Richardson's Hill, but Richard Taylor's brigade was fast approaching. The 6th Louisiana fell into battle line on the Tigers' left, and the 8th Louisiana extended the Confederate right to the railroad. Kenly now knew his command would be completely encircled if he did not get his men across the bridge at once. The 1st Maryland began to cross the bridge first, with the 5th New York performing a delaying action. Kinley wanted his infantry across both bridges so they could form a defensive line on Guard Hill. Once across the first bridge, they then crossed the North Fork. The only thing saving Kinley's infantry was that the 1st Maryland Confederate and Wheat's Tigers stopped in the Union camps to pillage and loot what they could find. Kinley then set up defenses on Guard Hill, and as the last Federal troops made it over the bridge, the structure was set ablaze. The two sides threw iron and lead at one another from across the river. To prevent the Confederates from pursuing, Kinley had to stay on Guard Hill until the bridge became so engulfed in flames that the enemy would not dare cross or put it out. But as he examined the bridge, he saw the 8th Louisiana crossing a ford to the east, and cavalry crossing a ford to the west. He was under the threat of being encircled. This time, the withdrawal was more disorderly, with infantry, cavalry, and artillery fleeing as best they could. Lieutenant Colonel Parnham, commander of the 29th Pennsylvania, after nearly getting his head caved in by a sword, was captured by Confederate cavalry. He and a bunch of his men were placed under guard. As they sat on the ground, Parnham thought of a plan. When his captors turned their backs, he jumped up and declared, "Here comes our reinforcements." The guards took off, and Parnham and his men made good their escape. Not all of them made it safely, though. 2 members of the Keystone State were discovered hiding in a field. A Confederate asked them who they belonged to. After stating the 29th Pennsylvania, the rebel stated, "It's a good thing you do not belong to the 28th Pennsylvania. I am going to kill every one I come across of them fellers. They stole all my old woman's pigs." Kinley did not escape. He went down with a saber slash to the back of his head, a slight cut on his neck, and a grazing wound to the head from a pistol ball discharged at point-blank range, together with numerous bruises on his face and chest from falling from his horse, made him a horrible sight. However, he survived. He was kept captive in Front Royal for a while, and his excellent treatment of the citizens while he occupied the town resulted in its citizens bringing him many fine meals while in confinement. He would be exchanged in June. The Union lost 773 men, 691 were captured, the others being killed or wounded. The Confederacy lost just 36 men killed and wounded. Although it was a small victory, it had great implications. Jackson had fooled Banks into thinking he was still south near Harrisonburg, but now he interposed himself between Banks and McDowell in the east. Reports of the defeat would trickle into Banks's headquarters. He now had a big decision to make. The morning after the engagement at Front Royal, Jackson didn't know what Banks's next move would be, but he gambled that news would reach the Union commander and that Banks would withdraw. Banks, unlike other Union commanders in the face of a defeat, kept a calm head and realized that with Front Royal taken, he needed to fall back closer to the Potomac River, and Winchester would be his destination. On the morning of May 24th, Banks began moving his troops and supplies toward Winchester. Union soldiers destroyed what could not be carried with them. In front of the main body was a large amount of supply wagons and ambulances carrying wounded soldiers. George Maryland Stewart didn't have a brigade-sized command, so Jackson reinforced his command with cavalry and tasked him with taking the road to Newton north of Front Royal. Ewell's division would march on the more direct route to Winchester to cut off Banks from that town, and Jackson and Ashby traveled to Cedarville on their way toward Middletown. Stewart caught up to the wagon train, overtaking a number of soldiers and wagons. However, Stewart did nothing to halt the advancing Union infantry columns of Williams's division. He and his horsemen rode north, leaving the wagons unhurt and the scattered teamsters and soldiers hiding in the woods along the turnpike. When Banks arrived with the infantry, the Union commander knew now that he was running a gauntlet of Confederate infantry and cavalry as he proceeded down the valley. Williams's infantry deployed against the Confederate cavalry and attacked, dispersing the rebels into the woods surrounding the turnpike. Jackson and Ashby advanced toward Middletown and encountered resistance from Brigadier General John Hatch's cavalry, along with some infantry. During the engagement, Jackson believed Banks was closer to Middletown than he actually was, and ordered Ewell to halt and send him reinforcements. But once Jackson scattered Hatch's men and occupied Middletown, he ordered Ewell to continue toward Winchester. Hatch's delaying action bought Banks a couple of hours, and he arrived in Winchester about sundown. Ewell would arrive late that night. Jackson arrived at Kernstown well after midnight. Both sides were worn out in their race for Winchester. Jackson's quick offensive dismantled the larger Union war effort. On the cusp of the fight at Front Royal, Abraham Lincoln planned for McDowell and Shields to march their combined 40,000 men toward Richmond and link up with George McClellan as he threatened Richmond. However, Banks alerted Lincoln to his own peril, which prompted the president to dispatch Shields back to the Shenandoah Valley, as well as order Fremont out of the mountains to the west into the valley near Harrisonburg to threaten Jackson from the south. Before dawn, Ewell received a single piece of paper with a simple map sketched on it, showing the disposition of Jackson's troops. Beneath the map read, "Attack at daylight." As the Confederate forces prepared for their dawn attack, Banks readied his men as well. The 3rd Wisconsin and 2nd Massachusetts sat west of the turnpike, with the 27th Indiana and 29th Pennsylvania in support. Artillery straddled the turnpike. The 28th New York, 5th Connecticut, and 46th Pennsylvania were on the extreme left of the line, reinforced with artillery. Banks was not fooled by the situation. He knew he was outnumbered, but he wasn't intending to win a great victory. His goal was to delay the Confederates long enough that his supply wagons could make it safely down the valley toward the Potomac to safety. This was a delaying action. The morning dawned and a heavy fog covered the field. One soldier remembered that he couldn't see more than 20 steps ahead. Both Ewell and Jackson's men pressed north toward the Union position. The 21st North Carolina, led by an impetuous colonel, advanced forward in columns of 4 toward the town of Winchester without sending out skirmishers. Worse yet, the fog prevented them from seeing the enemy. Skirmishers from the 1st Maryland Confederate alerted Donnelly's brigade that Confederates were approaching. 46th Pennsylvania and 5th Connecticut withdrew into a ravine and waited to ambush the enemy. Behind them, the 28th New York stood ready to deliver volleys from behind a stone wall. When the Tar Heels came into view, all 3 regiments let loose horrendous volleys. The North Carolinians were stunned and withdrew a short distance to a stone wall. The impetuous colonel unwisely decided to charge the enemy, which only resulted in even more casualties, disabling the regiment, and it quickly retreated back across Abrams Creek. On the Confederate left, Jackson was marching his men up the road and deployed most of the Stonewall Brigade to the west of the turnpike, with the 5th Virginia acting as skirmishers and the 33rd Virginia in reserve. Jackson and Winder were both former artillerymen and sought to use their artillery to their fullest effect. When the two sides began to engage, Jackson placed artillery at both ends of his line, supported by infantry. A devastating artillery duel erupted in between the skirmish lines. One Confederate artilleryman hadn't been with the battery very long. The new recruit would take the place of an exhausted or wounded crew member. When one man became too exhausted to ram the charges, the green soldier rushed up to take his place. Almost as soon as he got to the cannon, a bullet plowed into his head. For 2 hours the Union and Confederate artillery dueled as the infantry skirmished. As more Southern troops approached the town, Jackson and Winder placed them into battle lines and extended the left. As the cannons dueled, the Confederate commander saw Richard Taylor's brigade coming into view. Taylor's men were guided behind the Confederate lines further to the left. Jackson hoped to nearly encircle the Federals with his superior numbers. Taylor's men went behind the Virginians, but at one point the ranks became exposed to Union artillery fire, which wounded several of the Louisianians. Taylor fronted his troops so that they were perpendicular to the Union troops behind the stone wall. Taylor then led his men into the fields west of Winchester, marching in beautiful battle lines toward the flank of the Federal forces. Gordon ordered the 27th Indiana and the 29th Pennsylvania to extend the right of his line and hopefully hold back the 3,000 men from Louisiana. Those two regiments barely made it to their defensive locations before Taylor ordered his men to charge. Wheat's Tigers overlapped the right flank of the Pennsylvanians, capturing around 200 men of the regiment. The 27th Indiana and 2nd Massachusetts began to break first. Gordon attempted to halt the retreating men and form a line, but the superior numbers of the Confederate forces convinced them to keep moving to the rear. As the 29th Pennsylvania and the 3rd Wisconsin pulled back, the 1st Michigan Cavalry rushed forward, attempting to establish a second defensive line on orders from General Williams, but it was too late. It was now close to 8 a.m., and more of Jackson's infantry pushed toward and into the town. On the Union left, Donnelly's men were still confronting Ewell's division. After urging Ewell to let him attack and help Taylor push the Federals back through the town, General Isaac Trimble was given the order to advance with his brigade, but the Federal force in his front had nearly all escaped into the town. Banks's delaying action had worked. Although he had to leave behind a lot of supplies, his wagon train was safely north of town on their way to the Potomac. However, a few wagons still remained, along with wagon loads of supplies from sutlers who followed the army. Jackson's men, instead of pursuing the enemy, pillaged the wagons, many not having eaten for 24 hours. Others were too exhausted to push on further. The women of the town threw rocks, glass bottles, scalding hot water on the retreating Union troops as they made their way out of town. One Union soldier, wounded in the foot, sat down on the steps of a house. The door opened, and the woman of the house asked the soldier if he could walk. He said no. She asked for his pistol, which the beleaguered soldier kindly handed over to her. She took it, pointed at his head, and told him to run. As he limped away, she shot him in the back. Other accounts of women shooting Union soldiers appear in the writings of soldiers who survived the retreat. On at least one occasion, a woman who shot a Federal soldier was shot and mortally wounded herself by his comrades. Banks reached the Potomac with the last of his infantry at about 11 p.m. The Union commander helped push wagons through the mud and save mules from drowning in the deep waters at the Williamsport crossing. It may have been a defeat, but Banks had saved his wagons and many of his men from near disaster at Winchester. Jackson pursued Banks for about 3 miles, but then gave up the chase, being distraught that his cavalry were nowhere in sight. He returned to Winchester, checked himself into the Taylor Hotel, laid down in bed in full uniform, with his boots and even his spurs on, and went immediately to sleep, exhausted from the last few days. The casualties from Winchester is hard to calculate because Banks lumped in those casualties sustained at Front Royal, the march to Winchester, as well as the battle itself. One historian estimates that Banks lost 71 killed, 243 wounded, and 1,714 missing. However, many of those missing later reappeared, having been separated in the retreat and wandered the Virginia countryside for days attempting to find their units. Jackson lost 68 killed, 329 wounded, and 3 missing. The greatest part of the victory at Winchester for Jackson was the 9,354 stands of small arms, 500,000 rounds of ammunition, 34,000 pounds of commissary stores, and $125,185 worth of quartermaster supplies. The Union defeat forced Lincoln to rethink the movement of troops around Virginia. Lincoln remained calm after the defeat. However, when General John W. Geary, in charge of a small force on the east side of the Blue Ridge, reported that he was boxed in on 3 sides by Confederate forces, including 10,000 cavalry, making their way toward him imminently, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton grew increasingly worried and sent word to Northern governors to send what they could to defend the capital. This stressful moment passed when Banks finally got word to Washington that he had completed a successful withdrawal. Lincoln and his cabinet could breathe easier. However, the relief of knowing Banks's force was successfully across the river did not stop Lincoln and Stanton from calling for troops to converge on the valley to crush Jackson's army. After a few days' rest, Jackson's forces moved north. On May 29th, Jackson and Ewell's forces were concentrated at Halltown, about 12,200 strong, and the 2nd Virginia was at Loudon Heights near Harper's Ferry. Richard Taylor's 3,000-man brigade occupied Berryville. The 12th Georgia occupied Front Royal, and Ashby's cavalry were spread out guarding Jackson's flanks. 7,000 Union soldiers guarded Harper's Ferry. Banks, now reinforced, numbered around 7,000 at Williamsport. Fremont commanded 14,800 men approaching Jackson's rear from the Allegheny Plateau, and Shields' division numbered around 11,000 troops and were on their way to Front Royal, with Edward Ord's 10,000-man division just behind at Thoroughfare Gap. All the Union forces opposing Jackson's 16,300 men numbered around 52,400. On May 30th, Jackson began pulling his men back from their advanced position. He, along with his aide Sandy Pendleton, boarded a train to Winchester. As they were riding, a courier rode up to the train and signaled for it to stop. Pendleton took the note from the rider, who turned out to be Jed Hotchkiss, and handed it to Jackson. The general read it, then tore up the note, and went back to sleep in his seat aboard the train as it sped off for Winchester. The message was from the commander of the 12th Georgia. Shields had taken Front Royal and was advancing toward Strasburg. Stonewall, before boarding the train, had begun to get word from scouts and cavalry that more Union troops were concentrating on his position, attempting to cut him off from the upper valley. Jackson hoped to get all of his troops to Strasburg by the morning of May 31st. Most of Ewell and Jackson's forces made it to the town by that date, but Winder and the Stonewall Brigade were still behind, having the furthest to travel of all the troops. The Union forces, if they had moved quick enough, could have prevented Jackson from concentrating his forces and maybe defeated them in detail. But Shields pushed not much further than Front Royal because his commander, Irvin McDowell, issued no orders to advance. Fremont's troops faced incredible obstacles, attempting to cross the mountains in mud sometimes past their ankles. On June 1st, to hold the Federal troops at bay until Winder could join him, Jackson sent Ashby's cavalry out along the roads to the east to check Shields' advance and sent Fulkerson's brigade down the Moorfield Road against Fremont. Concerned that Fremont may pose a bigger threat, he sent Ewell to reinforce Fulkerson along the road. Intense skirmishing occurred between Fulkerson and the lead elements of Fremont's troops. However, the intensity subsided very quickly as Fremont skirmishers pulled back to the main body. By noon, the Stonewall Brigade made it safely to Strasburg. The quick marches done by both Ewell and Jackson's men gave rise to a popular story. One soldier stated that Jackson was a better leader than Moses. When another soldier asked why that was, he stated it took Moses 40 years to lead the Israelites through the wilderness, while Jackson would have double-quicked them through in 3 days. Stonewall wasted no time moving the Confederate forces up the valley, with Ashby's cavalry performing a rearguard action. To the east, Shields proposed a plan to McDowell for him to move south through Page Valley and cut Jackson off from Swift Run Gap. McDowell agreed to the movement, and as Jackson's forces moved up the valley, Fremont and Shields chased after him. To slow down the Union forces and prevent them from linking up, Jackson ordered the bridges burned in Page Valley and in front of Fremont's advancing columns. By June 3rd, Fremont was at Mount Jackson, just a few miles from Jackson's lines, but the burning of a bridge brought the Union advance to a halt. The rebels encamped at New Market. On June 5th, both Union and Confederate soldiers moved south, Jackson arriving around Harrisonburg. Fremont's troops continued to press the Confederate rear guard, and Shields halted his command, being too destitute of food and supplies to go on. Furthermore, Shields heard rumors of Longstreet's division approaching his command from Gordonsville, and pulled back toward Luray in preparation for a surprise attack, but he left Carroll's brigade to secure the bridge at Port Republic to prevent Jackson from retreating and allow for Shields to get behind Jackson's force. Fremont wanted more support to attack Jackson and requested Banks to join him, but Banks stated that his troops did not have enough supplies to make the march. Angry about the lack of cooperation, Fremont marched into Harrisonburg on June 6th around noon, as Jackson's army moved toward Cross Keys and Port Republic. That evening, Colonel Percy Wyndham, an English soldier and adventurer, led a mixture of companies from 3 regiments against Confederate cavalry guarding the rebel rear and flanks. He ordered a charge, but his men held back, leaving him alone. First Sergeant Holmes Conrad, seeing the lone cavalier, ordered his group of men to charge, but likewise his men failed to follow. Conrad got the upper hand on Wyndham, and the Englishman surrendered. As he was marched to the Confederate lines, he passed Chatham Wheat, the commander of the famous Wheat's Tigers. They knew one another from their time fighting with Garibaldi in Italy, and the men embraced one another before Wyndham marched off as a prisoner of war. After that altercation, Turner Ashby engaged a conglomeration of Union soldiers, including the 13th Pennsylvania Reserves known as the Bucktails, with a combination of his own cavalry and infantry supplied by General Ewell. During the fight, a bullet pierced Ashby's right side above the hip and exited under his left arm. He didn't speak at all when he was shot and died very quickly. Jackson mourned the loss of his cavalry commander, who had brought him through the campaign thus far. Colonel Thomas Munford replaced Ashby. To Jackson, the campaign was over. He had forced the Union High Command to deploy more troops to the valley, preventing them from linking up with George McClellan on the peninsula, which was his mission. He planned to leave the valley soon to link up with the rest of the Confederate forces around the capital. Carroll's brigade and the newly dispatched brigade under Tyler approached Jackson's force from the northeast. Likewise, Fremont began to move out from Harrisonburg to confront Jackson. Shields gave Carroll conflicting orders, first to burn the bridge and then to defend the bridge, crossing the river at Port Republic to block Jackson from escaping. Carroll surprised Jackson's small force at Port Republic on June 8th. Just a handful of men from the 2nd Virginia and some pieces of artillery guarded the town. with many wounded and sick men occupying the buildings. However, Taliafer's brigade encamped just a short distance away. Taking the rebels by surprise, the 1st Virginia Cavalry dashed across the middle ford of the river and entered the town with 2 artillery pieces. Once in the town, Carroll divided his Virginians, with part attacking the 2nd Virginia and the others attempting to guard the bridge. Hearing the commotion, Taliafer got his closest regiment formed and advanced against the bridge. Union artillerymen, seeing they were outgunned in the town, resolved to destroy the bridge against Carroll's orders, placing a gun at the mouth of the bridge and firing canister into it, hoping to partly destroy the structure. The 37th Virginia charged onto the bridge, driving the Federals from the town. The 2nd Virginia likewise forced the enemy in their front to retreat. Jackson then ordered the rest of Taliafer's brigade, interspersed with artillery, to position themselves to overlook the river and the Union position. The musketry and artillery shells rained down on the Bluecoats and forced Carroll's men to pull back in the direction of Conrad's store. For the moment, the Confederate rear was secure, but at Cross Keys, Fremont's force advanced on Richard Ewell's division. Ewell occupied the high ground around Mill Creek with around 5,000 men. Fremont outnumbered him 2-1, but Fremont believed that the roles were reversed, and he was outnumbered. Fremont conformed his brigades to the shape of Ewell's battle line, instead of choosing dispositions that would dislodge Ewell from his. Making matters worse, Fremont did not stay close to the action, unlike Ewell, who remained near the 4 batteries of artillery, 16 guns in all, that watched over the battlefield near the Confederate right center. At 10:30 a.m., both sides' artillery began a duel that would last hours. The first Union movement came when Stahl's brigade moved out before many of the rest of the division had aligned themselves, and Stahl did not coordinate his regiments properly. The 39th New York stayed behind to guard the artillery. The 41st New York and 27th Pennsylvania drifted to the right and stopped, leaving the 8th and 45th New York to proceed against the rebels. Unfortunately for the 8th, the 45th New York stopped early in the advance, leaving the 8th to confront the Confederate line alone. The New Yorkers, most of them German immigrants or of German descent, couldn't see the Georgians and Mississippians who were concealed behind a fence. The rebels allowed the New Yorkers to come within about 40 yards of their position before delivering a horrendous volley into them. Trimble sent the 15th Alabama to hit them in the flank as well. The Germans did not put up a fight and began to retreat after that one volley. Out of the 548 men they brought into battle, 43 were killed, 134 were wounded, and 43 were captured. Trimble's men advanced a little ways in the pursuit, but the brigade commander brought them back to the position behind the fence. Trimble then saw an artillery battery not far from his position and determined to capture it, sending the 15th Alabama to engage with the artillerymen and the few infantry, guarding them with orders to the Georgians and Mississippians to advance once the Alabamians made contact. The Alabamians withdrew after encountering stiff resistance, but the Mississippians followed orders and attacked when they saw the 15th make contact. The 21st Georgia did not move. The 16th Mississippi engaged with the 27th Pennsylvania and what remained of the 8th New York until the 21st Georgia finally arrived to drive back the Federals, but the artillery eluded capture. Stahl had requested that Boland's brigade offer him support, and Stahl's men fell back on the newly arrived brigade. Trimble took the initiative and was determined to beat back the Federal left flank. He called up the 13th and 25th Virginia, commanded by Colonel James A. Walker, on loan from Elzey's brigade, and dashed north along the road, with the 15th Alabama to their left. Trimble ordered Walker to keep his men to the right of Evers Farm and put pressure on that location. A Federal battery, supported by Boland's brigade, occupied that location and delivered some scary shots at the 13th Virginia. They deployed into battle line and began exchanging volleys with Federals, but something odd occurred on the field. Brigadier General Lewis Blinker, the division commander for Boland, Colts, and Stahl, arrived near the Evers Farm. He ordered the artillery battery to withdraw against his brigade commander's orders to remain. This confused the other Union regiments, who withdrew with the cannons. The 54th New York remained for a little longer near the Evers Farm, but Trimble brought the 21st Georgia and the 16th Mississippi to add weight to his numbers, which forced the New Yorkers to fall back with the rest of their brigade. Trimble then waited for Ewell's orders, but the battle was over in that section of the battlefield. During this entire fight, the artillery belched forth their iron projectiles, many of them finding their mark. General Elzey, riding in front of the Confederate lines during the duel, became wounded when a shell fragment hit his horse, opening a gash in his leg in the process. General Stuart got hit with shrapnel in the chest, lodging in his back. He had to be carried from the field. Captain Campbell Brown, the future son-in-law of General Ewell, was bringing messages back and forth when a piece of shrapnel hit him in the shoulder, stunning the young man, but leaving him relatively unhurt. Nevertheless, Ewell ordered him to Port Republic for medical attention. Along the way, Brown met Jackson, who was coming to the front. After a brief discussion of what was happening in Ewell's front, Jackson accompanied Brown to Port Republic. Jackson and Ewell never came into contact that day, demonstrating the confidence Stonewall had in the division commander. Jackson did bring reinforcements with him in the form of Richard Taylor's brigade, who would take the field soon. Brigadier General Milroy grew impatient with Fremont's lack of aggression. It was mid-afternoon when he, without orders, moved his brigade toward the rise on the opposite side of Mill Creek, occupied by Ewell's men. An abrupt encounter with some Virginia skirmishers posted in advance of the rebel line forced him to move further to the west, where he was partially protected from rebel artillery. The tenacious Milroy engaged with the Confederates across Mill Creek. The general's prized horse Jasper went down with 2 bullet wounds, forcing Milroy to leave the animal for dead on the field. Milroy looked after his brigade on foot. After the battle, he claimed that he could have stayed engaged against the rebels for a month if he needed to, as he hoped to turn the enemy's flank, but an unfortunate order arrived from Fremont. Milroy was to fall back. Begrudgingly, he did as he was told. As he did so, he saw Schenck's brigade standing idle. That brigade did little more than make it to the field. It did advance a short distance and engage briefly with Confederate skirmishers, but with only 4 killed, 8 wounded, and 4 missing during the whole engagement, that demonstrates he did not push as far forward as his report says. Fremont would pull all of his brigades across the Kieseltown Road and give his men a rest. The battle was small but significant. Ewell lost 288 men, 42 killed, 230 wounded, and 15 missing. Fremont lost 684 total, 114 killed, 443 wounded, and 127 missing. Now that Ewell had neutralized the threat to the west, Jackson could turn his attention to the smaller force to the east. Stonewall Jackson on June 8th had bested 2 attacks by part of Shields' division and Fremont's entire force. Now he was determined to cause as much havoc to the Union Army as possible. Attacking the small force of Tyler and Carroll provided the best opportunity to land a significant blow to one of the 2 Union forces confronting him. A small force would hold Fremont in check, while he would attack Shields' 2 brigades near Port Republic. Jackson would move his brigades out of Port Republic. Tyler and Carroll were camped close by and hoping that Shields would arrive with reinforcements. He promised Kimball's brigade was on the way. Winder divided his Stonewall Brigade along the road, with the 2nd and 4th Virginia to the right and the 5th and 27th Virginia to the left. Confederate shells bursting near the Union camps interrupted the breakfast planned by Carroll and Tyler at 6 a.m. Carroll urged Tyler to withdraw, but he refused and deployed his and Carroll's regiments near the Lewis Mill and near a hill called the Coaling, where the Lewis family made charcoal for their blacksmith shop. Winder sent the 2nd and 4th to attack the Coaling, which artillery occupied. Making their way slowly through the thick underbrush took time, and when they got to within rifle range, at least one artillery piece opened upon them with canisters, sending the Virginians scurrying back to safety. Winder hesitated to attack the Union infantry without adequate support, but he did advance the 5th Virginia forward a little ways to deal with the Union skirmishers. Jackson's brigades would be going in piecemeal, but he worked to get as many of them on the field as possible. The little town of Port Republic became congested with wagons, men, and artillery, which delayed reinforcements. Taylor's Louisiana Brigade made it through the town and sat down to prepare breakfast until Jackson rode up and ordered Taylor forward, with the 8th Louisiana in front. Stonewall rode ahead and began the placement of Taylor's brigade. The 8th and 9th Louisiana, along with Wheat's Tigers, deployed east of the road. Taylor was accompanying the 6th Louisiana and reported to Jackson for orders. Stonewall signaled for Hotchkiss to lead the 6th to the extreme right and outflank the artillery at the Coaling. Taylor struck off with the 6th and Hotchkiss, while the last of his regiments, the 7th Louisiana, filed to the left of the road to support Winder's men. The Louisianians situated themselves between the 5th and the 27th Virginia. Winder was elated with the reinforcements and decided to charge the Federal position. It was his best option. If he stayed put, his men would take unnecessary casualties from artillery fire, and if he pulled back, he would incur the wrath of Jackson, so his men took off toward the Union line. They stood toe-to-toe with the Federals for around an hour, exchanging volleys that destroyed their ranks. The 7th Louisiana lost half its strength in the exchange and was the first to start falling back for the rear. With their center disintegrating, the Virginians had no choice but to fall back as well, but as they fell back, the Federals pursued, fighting at every step of the way, pushing back part of the Stonewall Brigade. Jackson attempted to move more troops to the left flank that was caving in. He sent the 31st Virginia to the left as soon as the regiment made it to the field. However, the overwhelming numbers of the Federals pushed them back. Next came the 52nd Virginia. Winder used what soldiers he could to resist the approaching Federals, and the 52nd filed onto the left of the Confederate line. They made a noble stand, but the 7th Indiana and 29th Ohio pushed them aside as well. All the while, the Union right led a successful counterattack against Winder's brigade. The Confederate right was slowly advancing through the thick forest. Ewell had arrived on the field, but could not find Jackson to find out where to place the newest reinforcements, so he decided to support Taylor on the right. The 44th and 58th Virginia marched to the right of the road, but as they advanced, they saw Winder's men falling back and the exposed Union right flank open for an attack. Ewell turned the ranks to the left and delivered a deadly fire into the 5th Ohio. The volley surprised the Ohioans, but both the 5th and the 7th Ohio turned to face the Virginians and threw a deadly hail of lead into their ranks. The already small regiments grew even smaller with every blast from the blue ranks. Quickly, the Virginians fell back into the trees and would go on to support Taylor. The men from Louisiana were slow in the advance, but they made it to the coaling, opposite the Federal artillery. The 66th Ohio met them as they advanced. They exchanged one volley, and Taylor ordered his men to charge the artillery and the infantry. Afraid that the artillery would get away, the order came down to eliminate the horses. Wheat himself pulled out a bowie knife and went to work, with one soldier describing him as bloodier than a butcher when he finished. With the animal stopped from pulling away the artillery, Taylor focused on the infantry, fighting the 66th Ohio and other regiments coming to the artillery's rescue. The 5th and 7th Ohio even stopped their advance on the right and delivered assistance, nearly attacking the rear of the Confederate line. However, the growing Confederate numbers on the battlefield was turning the tide in favor of the rebels. General Ewell, with his hat in his hand, led the 44th and 58th Virginia on foot in the charge against Tyler and Carroll's men. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out all across the line, and finally, the Union left finally broke. With the left collapsing, Tyler and Carroll ordered the withdrawal of the rest of the units on the field. They made their way toward Conrad's store, with the Confederate forces launching a half-hearted pursuit. Most of them were exhausted and did not give chase for more than 3 miles. Even Tolliver's brigade, who had arrived right before the Union withdrawal, could not mount a successful chase. When the battle ended, the Union lost 1,002 men, and the Confederacy lost 816. General Fremont launched a late morning movement against Jackson, but found the battle already over and the bridge he needed to cross to engage Jackson burned. No attack would be made. After the battles of June 8th and 9th, both Shields and Fremont withdrew from their position under directions from the President, believing nothing else significant could be done in the valley. Jackson stayed at Brown's Gap for a short time, then returned to the valley just a little west of Port Republic. He sent word to General Lee that if he could get reinforcements of around 40,000 men, he would invade the North and bring the war to Pennsylvania. But with McClellan at the gates of Richmond, Lee needed every man to send the Union Army of the Potomac back down the peninsula. So Jackson would leave the valley from which he had gained so much fame. Newspapers praised his accomplishments, with one newspaper calling him the Gamecock of the Valley. Another newspaper, which had previously called him of unsound mind, printed a correction stating, "Since that time he has exhibited not the least symptom of improvement. Within the last 2 weeks he seems to have gone clean daft. With his foot cavalry at his heels, he has been raving, ramping, roaring, rearing, snorting, and cavorting up and down the valley, chawing up Yankees by the thousands as if they were many grains of parched corn." An army nurse in Alabama, Kate Cummings, wrote, "A star has risen, his name, Stonewall. The haughty foe has found to his cost has been given prophetically, as he proved a wall of granite to them. For 4 weeks he has kept at bay more than one of the boasted armies." Not all praised him. Many of his commanders criticized him for pushing his soldiers too hard. They had seen their regiments and brigades wither away due to hard marching and fighting. Some regiments could barely field 100 men by the end of the campaign. Jackson's campaign was not perfect. He made tactical mistakes, like at Kernstown in Port Republic, where he threw his troops in piecemeal. At McDowell, he was taken by surprise when Milroy attacked his troops, and he lost more defending Sitlington's Hill than Milroy did attacking it. Although criticized for the hard marching, it did save his men from being cut off by Fremont and Shields after the victory at Winchester. Ultimately, Jackson accomplished what Johnston and Lee wanted him to do. He diverted enough Union troops away from joining McClellan on the peninsula. He used the Appalachian Mountains to great advantage to bypass Union divisions and to surprise smaller enemy forces. Slowly but surely, he lured the Union high command into a false sense of security, leading them to remove troops from the valley. Then he preyed upon the small garrisons and outposts to whittle away at the Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley. For all of his mistakes and successes, Stonewall Jackson's Valley Campaign stands out as one of the most impressive military campaigns of the Civil War and military history in general. His accomplishments in the Valley made his nickname earned at Manassas echo across the North as an unstoppable enemy, and through the South as a military genius and hero.